I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, who's going to talk about the square in the town plan. And it's Todd Longstaffe-Gowan. He's a landscape architect and historian with an international practice based in London. And his work interests include the dramatic and sculptural potential of landscape. He's the author of many books, including The London Town Garden from 1700 to 1840, and more recently, The London Square, Gardens in the Midst of the Town, which is a very detailed and interesting book. As well as all this, he is also Gardens Advisor to the historic royal palaces, including Hampton Court, Kew, Kensington and Kensington Palaces. He also advises the Crown Estate. I'd like you to ask Todd to come to the lectern now. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to extemporise on the London Square to thank you very much first for inviting me. And I should say also I'm wearing another hat today. I'm the president of the London Parks and Gardens Trust, and we also have Chris Sumner here too. And squares are very much in our sights and part of our principal activities at the London Parks and Gardens Trust. So I'm bringing to the fore one of our great interests. So I thought today would be helpful to talk about is the square and the town plan, and I want to emphasise how in London, certainly, the domestic square, and it really is, in London that's what it is. It's nothing, it's not great urban space for the public, it's a private garden square that really captivates me and is really what the legacy is in London. So I want to talk about those particularly, and I want to talk about both the physical and the social dimension because, as has been talked about in the previous lectures, that's the really most important thing to understand is why they want to be built and how they're important socially and why they're still relevant in today's society. So here you can see a view of Queen Square in London, built in the late 18th century. It encapsulates to me all of the aspects of a square that one tried to achieve in the late 18th century, which is to have, as it were, a wonderful open space and views to the countryside beyond. You have regular houses on around the perimeter, and of course you have people in the foreground, because squares are all about the intermixing of people. Granted, squares were very exclusive, and in London, almost entirely enclosed, the exclusion of non-ratepayers, but the public was welcome in the perimeters anyways. But there was also a lot of social interaction in the streets around them. Views, of course, being very important, which I'll go into in just a moment. Now, this is a wonderful view of from the early 1960s, showing the archetypal London Square. It's a square in the Ladbroke Estate. You've all been to Notting Hill or certainly heard about it. And it really encapsulates what to the average Londoner is a square. You've got the perimeter enclosure, the fence that keeps away the people, the ne'er-do-wells, the people who don't pay rates for the management of this wonderful private space. You've got the Serpentine Walk and the plantations. The walk is to keep everyone on there. You can see the little low railings to make sure that everyone keeps off the grass. All squares, like all London spaces, are very heavily regulated. The English love being regulated, and squares were the archetypal thing. Ever since the very beginning, squares had nothing short of a duodecon when you came inside saying what exactly you were allowed to do, and more importantly, what you were not allowed to do, because they were very rigidly enforced. And this was all about social conduct within an open space. And gardens required a great deal of regulation, because people would practice the most terrible excesses in these wonderful open spaces, so it was always a source of great amusement and importance to keep this regulated. But also you get here the nanny, everyone of any particular class. These were great perquisites of the upper middle classes, so nannies were a necessity, taking the urchins into the square for their regular exercise. Children were, on a regular basis, at least from the 18th century, frog-marched around most of the squares to get their exercise. There weren't many other places for them to interact with their social equals, and this was an important part of the socialization of children. In fact, they say from the early 19th century it was important that children should form strong social relationships with the people who they'd be working with and living with in the future. These were the centers, as it were, of great domestic communities, or great important social communities. And here you have an elderly gentleman who performs the role of vigilance in this open space. There were always square keepers of a sort, but he was watching over these children to make sure that everything goes according to plan. Now, it's been mentioned earlier that Covent Garden is a very important space. It certainly is considered to be the earliest open square in London. It was more of a piazza, as has been said earlier on. But the precedent's quite important in establishing the square as a great opening in the town, as they were called originally. And you can see why. Medieval London was a very densely populated place, and the act of creating some large open space within it was incredibly important. And it was really, the principles behind it were the establishment of open space and light and ventilation as well, because there were lots of contagions, lots of reasons why you wanted open spaces too, but there was no particular program for these spaces, and this was the great problem. It was all right importing these lavish ideas from the continent. These windy piazzas, though, really needed some sort of social programming to work. And when they were initially thought out, in Covent Garden in particular, was not really a success for many reasons. One is it didn't have a social program. It had the landlord's house in the south and domestic houses around the perimeter, but they hadn't decided what to do in the centre. They put a tree and then latterly a sundial, but this really wasn't adequate, as you can imagine, and it led, also there was a terrible problem with the drains, which forced all the rich people who had every intention of inhabiting this wonderful square to move out. And then it was colonized by thespians who've ruled the roost ever since and lowered the tone. So this has changed the square inevitably. And also, a market moved in the centre. And this again was something that later builders would realize. It wasn't, you had to provide a market space outside the square so that commerce wouldn't destroy this wonderful temple. St. James's Square here, built in the 1660s, after the restoration of the monarchy, this is really when things start to take off. People have travelled extensively, so everyone's been to France and Spain. Spain, very important. Plaza Mayor, built in the late 17th century, really quite important. Charles I had been there, and Jones had been influenced by it as well. Here you have, as it were, the square being the centre of the community. You can see around it radiating in degrees of social importance the streets that surround this. This is not only a change in the way people lived, it was a change in the way you moved through town, because the centres now are not centres of commerce, they're centres of residential development. And this commerce moves round it. And this is the precedent that also started at Covent Garden. The streets were changed, so you couldn't just drive in and drive out. You had to move round the space. And this is absolutely important, and you'll notice the way that the streets move in, the entrance streets, how they create the kind of space that you're actually in and moving through. They didn't want lots of other traffic. They were trying to dissuade people from moving into these spaces. These were the cause of these residential communities. And although these places like St. James's Square, when first laid out in the 1660s, didn't have a purpose, it was a great open space dedicated to the public who lived, or the people who lived there. And this was their private domain. You must understand also that most people who came to live in London from the 17th century, when the square became important, are the people who lived in the country most of their lives. This is a completely new way of living. No member of the upper middle class of the aristocracy had ever dreamt of living closer than a mile together in the country. This idea of cohabiting in a small space was quite an unusual thing to do. So this was a great change in the way that Londoners were prepared to live, especially as the numbers increased. Prior to this, also, there'd been no particular kind of order. People lived in long streets, in nicest neighbourhoods, but it was rather less socially prescribed. The square all of a sudden establishes a great hierarchy in the town too. And as I said, you'll notice, as I show you some more examples, that the square was a social centre. It was the grandest part of the community. From there, you had radiating degrees of grandeur, and that was very important for understanding how the square works. Also, for many of the early squares, you had churches affiliated. On the north side of the square, you had a view to St. James's Piccadilly. So it wasn't always precisely in the square, but was associated with that. But religion was never that important, nor were statues. It's been mentioned earlier that statues were considered to be important things. In London, certainly, there was an idea that one might like some sort of political allegiance, but at the same time, most Londoners were far too mean, put their hands in their pockets to pay for statues, and nor were they interested in nailing their colours to one particular mast when there was a likelihood the government might change, and you didn't want to be tarred, as it were, with one particular person. So many statues were promised as being formed. So when you were buying into your square, they may say, and we propose to build a statue to the king based on the statue that was put up in Hanover Square. This seldom took place because the residents who paid for the improvements weren't really prepared to pay for these things. This is an important slide because it shows you a moment in 1719 when squares become a little bit more important because they start to link communities, become pivots in the community. As we've seen in our last presentation, there was an effort to try and link squares on a single estate. What was far more difficult was to work with many landlords to try and bring their estates together. You may know, of course, that London is built on a series of great estates formed after the dissolution of the monasteries. All these great landlords who are benefiting from this great surge in development in the 18th century and the 17th century decide that the square will be the principal mechanism to bring residential communities together. They use the square emphatically and creatively to link not only their own estates and to form these social centres, but to link the various estates together. So here you have this lovely ligature that runs north-south, connecting these two squares, Cavendish Square on the north and Hanover Square on the south. And here I show a view, I'm sorry, I meant to show another view of the other square, but this is in fact St. James's Square, as it was built in the 1660s. You can see there was a large basin at the centre. This was after a considerable time when the square had been left open and subject to all sorts of abuses. When they finally started to improve it, they said they had to do so. They had to seek almost like a private enclosure bill because they said that it was so badly abused by people who came and dumped rubbish and cats and dead horses. Any number of abuses took place, so they had to mediate this. They had to seek a private act of Parliament to enclose the spaces. And what more natural than create a basin? Very selfishly, well, it was because most of their houses were subject to terrible fires. And it's no coincidence that no less than 2 large landowners in the square had suffered fire the year before, and one was a major shareholder in the water company. So, of course, a plus ça change. There's always some money to be made by somebody. But here you have, as it were, this wonderful pond. And there was, in fact, a gondola and a gondolier to enliven the water for those who lived there. There had been a plinth for a statue, but that, again, only was raised in the 1820s, so 160 years after planned. This is the junction, as I meant to show you earlier, between Hanover and Cavendish Square, this great visto that was celebrated, the greatest Baroque gesture in London, now completely spoilt, unfortunately, by sort of dustbins and signs and litter. And this is my big campaign to try and get Westminster to wake up and try and revivify this, rather than just dumping some public art in the space and saying this is much better. But this view is still there and can be revived. But what's important here is looking up towards, and you see the church on the left-hand side, across 2 squares, this fantastic unity of these 2 estates with disparate interests, disparate landowners, but this idea of trying to link it. Here you are looking the opposite direction, and you can see again across these the grain of the city, the wonderful squares, the open spaces, and how important they are. This view by a Swede, it was always foreigners who made the most wonderful observations. I think this is a fantastic social statement of the square. You get Mary's people, as it were, just walking, perambulating. You get a few beasts, goats and things like that. You get a couple canoodling on the right-hand side. As the gardens were, of course, synonymous always with sex and misdemeanors, and this was a great distraction, asset, whatever you want to call it, in many of these garden squares, but certainly enlivens these spaces dramatically throughout their history. This is a view of the 1720 plan for the Grosvenor Estate. The Grosvenor Estate, almost 90 acres in central London, one of the greatest developments to take place in a residential way. And you'll notice that these are all private initiatives and they have nothing to do with the state. It's all about these great landlords who are deciding the social character, the social and physical character of London. And this is really what we still find so wonderfully tantalizing about London are these great private initiatives. They've really dictated the character of our city for centuries. You can see a great oval, so not a square, looking again to this, like the Campidoglio or whatever you want, some wonderful antique precedent, but creating again this rather brilliant and unusual for London cadaster, these streets all in a regular outline. And this again set the square at the centre of these 90 acres. But you can see the irregular outlines, no attempt really to try and work with the neighbouring landlords. Here, a very grand man, the Grosvenors, a family later the Dukes of Westminster, decided the neighbours could, as it were, fit together. And the squares did. You had Berkeley Square and other squares at the top, linking up with the square, which became a magnet for the social development of this part of London. This square is developed more or less the same time as the book is published in 1722 by Thomas Fairchild, called The City Gardener, which starts for the first time telling you how to lay out a square. And he advocated making small mounts at the centre covered in trees and putting fountains and other gestures on the sides of these squares. It must be stated these were private gardens. They were not open to the public. They were open to ratepayers. Ever since the about 1720s, when the first private Act of Parliament was passed in London for St James's Square, every landlord who built a square jumped on the bandwagon and made his garden private, to the exclusion of non-ratepayers. You were frontagers, and you paid a rate towards the maintenance of your private square, and admittance was only to key holders. So these ornaments on the side are to, as it were, for the public as well as for the people who live in the square, but the delectation of the square is for those who live in the space itself. This was the square, and so you can see the derivation. This is 1726, the plan by the gardener, Mr. Wellston, laid out for Grosvenor Square, so the great oval at the centre of the Grosvenor estate. He's looking directly at Fairchild for the inspiration, and you'll see this wonderful sort of Union Jack at the centre, and then there's a lawn, a large lawn, upon which is placed a statue of the reigning monarch, double gilt. This statue had gone up, and no, it hadn't been up more than about a few weeks, and it had been vandalised very badly. The French said it was typical iconoclasm. The English explained it away as just good old, terrible, raunchy antics, by, as it were, some rowdy boys in the middle of the afternoon who'd just gone in and destroyed this thing. It still happens all the time in London, and statues have been always destroyed and pulled apart by the hoi polloi. Here you can see the statue, as it were, as it had been put up. You can see again this sort of strange layout of the garden. This is before they become much more informal, but it's like this great monarch has been mentioned earlier, the King Louis at the centre, and he was compared to that. We were always looking over our shoulder to France, but it's like he's marshalling his troops. This formal order was soon destroyed. But you can see again the relationship of the square to its neighbouring communities, and this idea too that it has a relationship to the countryside. And these views, produced in huge numbers in the early 18th century, are very important for publicising the square. It was these topographical prints produced in great numbers that made London unique. And in fact, if you look at these views, what's fascinating about them is that when they were reissued throughout the 18th century, the gardens were constantly scratched out and made new in the prints, but the buildings remained absolutely the same. So you can see that the centre of these things, the gardens, were the principal point of interest, and this is what made London unique, and certainly very interesting to all these people who were coming as tourists in great numbers to the great imperial capital. By the mid-18th century, this is about 1766, and it's Gwyn's effort to show squares in the town, and also this is to celebrate the centenary of the Great Fire. You'll see how squares, some real, some proposed, have become principal pivots within town. These are also all residential quarters, so these squares that pop up like rond-point and regular places are the defining centres of living residential communities, not businesses, not churches, not markets, but these are living communities with people who have an interest in sustaining the residential character of these neighbourhoods. Now, this is one of those squares that was built off the top of Grosvenor Square. It related entirely. The entrance streets came straight up the edges. It's the Portman estate, and it's Portman Square. It was built in an open field, and like so many squares, the garden was laid out first. The landlord, who dictated the social and physical character of the neighbourhood, would explain that the first thing you had to create was the square itself. So here you have another oval, ovals being very common at the time. In fact, many squares were recast not only in their layout, but in their shape. In the 18th century, squares changed constantly. We imagine now that they're very sort of dour, unchanging things, but throughout the 18th century, when there were very great and important attributes of these areas, they were changing constantly from squares to octagons to circles and ovals to reflect the changes in taste, not only just the planting. But here, as you have this wonderful community growing up around this square, it's fascinating in an Irish context. This, in fact, was a very heavily Irish-populated part of London, mostly tinkers, it must be said, but they were excluded, as it were, from the square. They pushed straight out, as it were, when this new social community was built here, but they had their retribution, because, in fact, there are wonderful accounts from the minute books saying that after the square had been built and all these Rubicon young children were commonly disporting themselves in the square with their nannies, that the Irish used to they'd take their children, dump them over the railings to interact with the little rich Londoners. and giving them many communicable diseases, as they say, at the same time. Who knows? Here is a later view of Portman Square. You can see again how this nucleus forms the center of this wonderful place, and how quickly more squares pop up, in fact in huge numbers, and especially by the late 18th, early 19th century, it was said that no community was complete without a square of some form. Most interestingly, of course, on your left-hand side, you see what was called the twin deformities of Montague and Bryanston Square, said to be far too thin for a square, but still every developer was trying to squeeze in as much garden space as you could. This at a time when land is becoming incredibly valuable, it was thought that you had to give up land to draw the people that you wanted, the desirable communities, into your property in the first place, because everyone was seeking open space. This shows another view of Portman Square, so you can get again the sense of how these communities were based around these wonderful places. You'll see again, although there's an aspiration to create social homogeneity and physical homogeneity, the buildings seldom became very uniform, and the gardens, in fact, it reflected the fact that gardens themselves were also very disparately laid out, and here you have this rather more picturesque garden laid out in the late 18th century. As I said, gardens really weren't important in these places until they were enclosed. It's sort of like a pond drying up, and as it dries up, it becomes colonized with plants and things. And this is the same thing here, as railings, as the spaces have no program and they become private, then the first urge is to create some privacy. With the advent of cast iron and things, you can actually create see-through railings. But then, of course, you don't really want people peering in when you're having a nice place, a nice time in your garden, so you start closing those off. And then these become greater and greater oases and more planted, and this is the nature of these places themselves. Here you can see in the Bedford estate the gardens as they progressed very quickly around the Bedford estate and became a sort of city of squares. And again, this was also true in around Eaton Square and Belgravia, all these communities being developed by huge developers in conjunction with the landlords to convert vast tracts of land into areas designated as these square communities. And this is another picturesque, or another view that shows an oblique view into the London Square. This is, again, Eaton Square, so you can get a sense of how these places worked and how the people interacted on the outside as well as the inside. And again, Tyburnia, all over London throughout the early 19th century, squares were the driving force that changed the fabric of town, and most notably Notting Hill, where you have the inversion of the square, where the square becomes a paddock. It was what is called a paddock from the early 19th century, more or less because I think you dumped your children in there like cattle or sheep, and they could be watched separately, and they didn't have to cross the road, so the garden's behind there. So this is an inversion, as it were, of the London Square. And here you get this fantastic view of what these gardens are still like and persist through to this time. And the notion of the square still was very important throughout the whole of the last century. After the war, they were also thought in the great plans to redevelop London. It was important these garden squares should be preserved, and this plan did this. So to conclude, I want to emphasize, and I showed this slide, I think, last time I spoke in Dublin, but it's so wonderful. It encapsulates the social importance of the square, the idiosyncrasies, the social snobbery of these fantastic spaces. And this is really what makes them so fantastically unusual. And they were compared to miniature sort of European states because they were so independent, so proud, so rich, so they just didn't give a damn about their neighbors, but they became these little enclaves of people, and that's what kept them so fantastically unique. And this is a modern interpretation of this, done from 2011, the same idea, idea mentions how you can meet a hoodie in one corner and how you're unlikely to go to another part of the square. It's really worth looking at very closely, but it talks about the social qualities that make these spaces so unusual. And I just want to end on this particular slide, which again emphasizes the fact this is what a good square is all about. It's about a residential hub where people can interact both on the inside and the outside, but it is this idea that there is some sort of social uniformity, but at the same time a great deal of eccentricity that can operate in the same public space. Thank you very much.